Let me officially welcome you now to our UWorld Medical Fireside Chat, where we're going to be talking about dedicated study time. And we just had a really good 5-minute extra run through, so we will try to keep this rolling smoothly now. We want to say, again, welcome. Today we're going to be talking about what and how to study and how to stay sane and healthy during dedicated study time. We're going to be keeping it kind of conversational. So my name's Simone, this is Jenny, and we are both members of the physician content team here at UWorld, and we're also friends. So we have put this together and really hope to provide some helpful tips for you. To that end, we are going to be posting links down in the description of the webinar that you can access afterwards. We'll be discussing some of them as we go today. We hope that they'll really be helpful for you. And we'll also be recording this session, so if you find it helpful, you can refer back to it or forward it on to your friends. At the very end of our conversation, we'll be having a question and answer session. So as we go along, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. In addition to that, if you think of any topics you'd like us to discuss in a future webinar, please put those in the chat as well. So before we get started, I'm just going to brag on my friend here a little bit. So Janani is triple board certified in internal medicine, general preventative medicine and public health, and lifestyle medicine. That is a lot of studying. So you can give us good tips on studying. In addition, so currently she works here at UWorld on the content team, but also has a practice in primary care and coaching. And then before you came to UWorld, one of your roles was as Director of Student Wellness at the University of Texas Rio Grande Valley School of Medicine. So I think you're pretty much the perfect person today to talk to us about dedicated study time, especially as it pertains to wellness. So thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it. Let's jump in. So we're going to start with kind of a conversation about what and how to study. So when students are, entering dedicated study time, they have been using a lot of resources over their preclinical, years. So that includes textbooks, other passive resources like, videos, maybe podcasts even, maybe active resources like Q banks, flashcards. So when they get to dedicated, I think one of the real challenges is trying to figure out how to triage their time and which resources to use. Do you have any kind of like high-level advice about that?
Absolutely. So first of all, so great to be here, sharing evidence-based techniques for actually how to study, which I totally wish I had known when I was taking the exam. Yeah. I can vividly remember studying for it and have mentored many students who are taking it. And the great news is there really is a time-tested approach to this stuff. Evidence-based, everything we do here is evidence-based. So it's exciting to be able to share that with you. To sort of start, the biggest picture is to know yourself. And this is really, really important. Knowing what has worked for you in the past, knowing what your true strengths and your weaknesses are, taking a real honest inventory of that. Very, very important. Why? Because as you get into studying, it's very easy to become scatterbrained and sort of someone's doing something and you think you have to do it. And then, you kind of spread yourself too thin. Ties into that second point, which is be selective and go deep. It's much better to pick a few things and really know them rather than trying like the next greatest thing just because someone else is doing it. When you have a solid understanding of who you are and what's worked for you and what your strengths and weaknesses are, you can be real honest with yourself and just pick those resources and go deep. The third point, this is really, really important, kind of one of the secret sauces of the secret sauces, is to maximize your ratio of active over passive learning. So yes, we all need to do passive learning, but passive learning is like when you're reading a textbook and trying to memorize it. Not the most effective. Active approaches are when you're taking that material and making that your own, either by writing it out or, doing flashcards, mnemonics, all kinds of things. But the key is for maximizing your study potential and your performance in general on the exam, you want to try to make your approaches as active as possible. I might add that the highest yield active approach for learning is taking questions. So I'm sure we're going to talk about that, hopefully more.
Yeah, we should. Yeah, we will talk about that. Can you go a little bit more into detail about, passive versus active learning kind of over the course of dedicated? I imagine that a lot of students will start out with, more review of material at the beginning and then kind of progress more towards active. But I know even, kind of over the course of dedicated within a day, like what would you advise as far as that ratio? I don't know if there's a perfect ratio, but a ratio of passive to active learning.
Yes.
Or
Great
reviewing.
question, right? So you want to limit those chunks of passive learning time. That's going to be key. And that doesn't mean that you don't use passive references like first aid, but there is a way to make even your passive learning as active as possible. Let's take nephrology, our favorite subject.
Not my favorite subject.
As an example. Let's say you're having to learn about the structure and function of a nephron. Well, you read about that in your passive reference material, then close the book, and then write out what you remember. You could write it out, you could sketch out a table or a diagram from memory. You could literally pace the room and talk it out and see what you remember. This is a great way to highlight the areas that you're a little bit iffy about. You go back to the reference material, fill in the gaps, and rinse and repeat. So when you do this, and even though it takes a little bit more work than just like reading a page statically, you are able to much more effectively know that information. You've ingrained it in your memory. So we mentioned that a really high yield approach for active learning is questions and yes. So you really want in your studying to use that Q bank. Don't even think of it as you're testing your memory. You're actually using the Q bank to actually learn the material and retain that material. So make sure you go through that Q bank, calculate the number of questions per day that you need to make that happen. And key is you want to actually practice simulating test day. So those sim exams are gonna come in really handy. Find times, actual days in your study session where you just do the sim exams and replicate the testing environment as much as possible. Same time, same timing of breaks, same meals, same snacks. So that's really gonna get you to feel more mentally comfortable with that testing environment and just get you more familiarized with the material in general.
I totally love that advice. You can even wear your lucky socks, just like you're going to do on the day of the exam. We all know that you do that. I might have done that. So you were mentioning the Q bank, and I know that we're a little bit biased because we work for UWorld, but we know that Q banks have a lot of benefits for students, and there's actually science behind that. Can you share a little bit about that science that's behind why Q banks are so good for both learning and then retention of information?
Absolutely. So even before I knew anything about working at UWorld, I was recommending this to students because it's so effective. Literally since the 1890s, people have been reporting on how effective test-enhanced learning is at retaining information. So if you wanted to spit out something 5 minutes later, studying a page is great, but we don't want to do that on the test. We want to be able to actually practice very different skills from just short-term memorization. We actually want to be able to practice retention, retrieval, and synthesis. So those are distinct skills that are very different from even your intelligence or even just your ability to memorize. So when you are taking questions, you're actually practicing retrieving from memory, and retrieval from memory improves memory. It's like it's just a thing. You're basically doing mental reps in the gym of learning, as it were. So when you take those questions, you're actually presented with a vignette. You're presented with something, and you have to sort out the important facts and then match it to an answer. This is an effect known as chunking. It is much easier to remember information in the context of an overall whole rather than trying to just randomly draw facts at will. So when you have a vignette, you're able to contextualize it, you're able to more easily retrieve that information. Another really interesting point about why test-enhanced learning works, turns out that when you're faced with that multiple choice question, you actually activate a little mini stress response, a positive stress response in this case. Your attention goes through the amygdala, and the amygdala can modulate the strength and intensity of a memory. So when you actually are faced with this vignette, your memory is going through the amygdala, it takes fewer reps to get that same level of memory retention. That's pretty cool. So pretty neat. The other neat thing about UWorld in particular is that it provides such detailed question feedback, the explanations. And there's actually studies that have looked at the effect of receiving question feedback on learning. And it turns out that reviewing that question feedback is especially effective for those low confidence answers in particular, like those questions you were sort of like, I think that's the answer, but I'm not sure. It could be A or C. I'm gonna pick C. Turns out when you review those questions and that feedback, it strengthens the memory in particular. There is, interestingly, an increased effect if you delay reviewing question feedback to the end of the block. Not to say you shouldn't use tutor mode, but as you're getting closer to the exam, you may want to actually delay that review of the feedback. And I can't emphasize enough, use that review of explanations as a dedicated study session. It's not just an afterthought, right? It's actually reviewing, and you're getting so much information in your brain. I actually recommend keeping a separate sheet of paper where you write down the sticky points from reviewing explanations. It's a really handy thing to do.
So you're saying that there's like the increased benefit, like if a student takes, their 40 question block kind of back to back to back to back, and then waits until they finish all of them to actually review the explanations.
Yes.
Okay, so how you do that is then you turn off tutor mode, and then for extra exam simulation you could turn on timed mode, for example, just to kind of break down how that happens. Okay, so then if we're going, we've kind of covered over the course of dedicated the balance between passive and active resources, and we've talked about kind of maybe shifting from reviewing your harder topics earlier on and then moving into exam simulation, whether it's like sim exam days and things like that. I'd like us to like zoom in on the level of like an individual study day. So I think one of the challenges that students face, and I remember this, was mental fatigue. So you're, kind of getting through your day and you start to run out of steam. Are there things that students can do to optimize each individual study day to kind of keep their brains sharper for longer throughout the day and decrease that mental fatigue?
Absolutely. Great question, right? We're only as good as our level of alertness. There's no point in studying and for long stretches of time if we're experiencing that fatigue. Luckily, there are ways to really optimize your attention level. First, just capitalizing on your natural circadian rhythms. Typically, most people, and I know there are exceptions to this, but most people are at their peak performance for tedious tasks the first 4 hours after waking up. So that's a great time to tackle those weaker areas, to do those kind of passive reviewing, things that take a lot of brain power. 10 hours after rising, typically like after lunch, we all experience that natural dip in alertness. That's a great time to use questions as your kind of unpleasant caffeine boost that stimulates mental arousal, right? That mini stress response that's good and can kind of force you to be in that zone a little bit more. So the afternoon's generally a great time to do sort of questions in that vein. So using, like you mentioned, all the UWorld modes strategically. When we then think about, optimizing alertness, think about how you're approaching that weak area or that subject material. We'll pick nephrology, your favorite subject. So one way that you could approach this, you sort of start by warming yourself up, maybe 5-6 untimed questions just to get your brain in gear. You do that, review those explanations, then you jump into the concepts that you need to learn that day. And using that combination of the active and passive approaches, flashcards, mnemonics, all the things, right? At the end of that, you really cement in that knowledge by taking a block of questions specifically on that topic, right? Specifically on nephrology. You do those questions, then you take a break. I do want to talk about breaks because, as it turns out, there is an evidence-based length of time for your study sessions. You want to break that up. You don't want to do an 8-hour study marathon. You could do that, but chances are it's not going to be that productive. So you want to sort of have your focus segments be around 50 to 90 minutes, give or take.
Okay.
Don't be exactly attached to the time. You typically are going to know, if you know yourself, what your peak performance time blocks are and when you start to have diminishing returns, but you do want to take breaks, and you do want to take those breaks often. When you do take a break, and let's say you were doing your passive hybrid, passive active learning on nephrology, and you took those questions on nephrology, after your break, your next study session could then be just reviewing those explanations. And then you repeat the same process over and over again. So you do want to make sure that you also in all of this have randomized question blocks. You don't only want to do content specific question blocks, is you want to keep that performance optimization similar to the exam as well. So you can use the UWorld questions strategically to help yourself learn a weak subject or learn subject-specific information, and then you can use randomized questions to hone in your performance for test day.
That's great advice.
Yeah. And then there's
Sorry.
there's also things independent of even the studying that you can do, that sort of like study hacks that can optimize your focus and attention. Do you want to talk about those?
No, I mean, anything practical that you can share with us would be great.
Awesome. Okay, so this is stuff like using your senses and just using things like breathing and movement to actually increase your attention and motivation. So let's talk about sound. It turns out that there's a type of music or music frequency called binaural beats. You use it wearing headphones. That's when a different frequency is tuned into each ear, typically about 10 hertz of a difference. When we're in a high attention state, when we're learning, we tend to secrete, our brains tend to be entrained to alpha brainwave states, about 15 to 40 hertz. If you play binaural beats in that same frequency family, you can actually improve your attention and focus. So that's something that's easy to do. Try it and see if it works for you. Just listening to binaural beats, focused on focus. The other thing you can do, breathing. So there's specific breathwork techniques. I think breathing is the most underrated tool that you can use to optimize performance and recovery, right? But one specific way of breathing that you can do before you start a study session is sort of controlled hyperventilation. It doesn't sound like it would be good, but there's a reason for why it works. And that's when you take rapid, short inhalations and exhalations, and you do that maybe 15 cycles, and then you do a breath hold. What's happening there is that you're increasing epinephrine, norepinephrine from your adrenal glands, but you're doing it in a controlled fashion, as opposed to stress uncontrollably hitting you. So you are controlling your response to stress when you're doing those breath holds. It also promotes great burst of energy and attention. It's been studied pretty extensively, and pretty good effects on pre-workout or mental workout in this case, in terms of increasing that focus and attention. There's another simple thing you can do, which is using your vision. So your mental focus follows your visual focus. When you are about to start studying, simply focus your vision on an object for 30 seconds to a minute. It is a natural way to increase your attention and focus right then. Same thing with smell. You can sort of create an association between a certain smell and, hey, it's time to study, similar to like Pavlovian response. So these are all things that are like very available to most people. Doesn't cost any fancy equipment or nothing needed, and you can actually maximize your study time, study effects.
So I love that. Like, I think things have gotten a lot fancier, but back in the day, like with step one studying, I remember using peppermint chapstick, like over and over and over, and then like in the break sessions of the exam, it was like the smell thing that you were talking about. And I guess I'll just say that, all of those tips, I think, can be really helpful, and obviously try and see what works for you. But it reminds me of, have you read Atomic Habits? That's like one of my books in the last 2 years that I've really loved, and I refer back to it a lot. But basically, if you haven't read it, it's it's this bestseller that's nonfiction. It talks about how atomic, meaning very tiny, habits, if you put a bunch of them together, can add up to like an outsized response or outsized improvement, like more than you would expect. And so I kind of feel like some of these things, like binaural beats or like breath work, using smell or visual focus, they're little things, but if they add up and help you, why not? Why not try them? Why not try multiple of them and see if it really helps? So thank you for that. I'd like to circle back. You were talking about breaks. So I think, yes, breaks are important. I think most of us would recognize like an 8-hour power session doesn't really exist. Like none of our brains can really hold attention that long. And you mentioned, 50 to 90 minutes sort of being like an optimal period of time to have for a focus segment. I'm wondering if you have any tips for those breaks in between. And in particular, I want to kind of focus on this area because I know that a lot of us kind of have overachieving tendencies, and 15 to 90 minutes is up, and we think to ourselves, well, maybe I don't really need a break, because I don't need it or I feel guilty about it. But I'd like to see if you could talk a little bit about why they're so important, and then also if there is like something that's a way to optimize breaks, or if I'm imagining that there's some activities that are better than others for breaks. Do you have any advice about that?
Yes, absolutely. Not that I was one of those people, by the way, but yeah. Yes, you definitely should take breaks. So there's actually some evidence to suggest that you want your break duration to be a little over 10 minutes to maximize productivity. Now, your break activities are key. You want to think about activities that are going to help your brain recover from this intense work effort, similar to recovery, if you were working out intensely. So what are some things you can do? I recommend going outside and literally broaden your focus. You've just been staring at something very intently for the past 90 minutes. Go outside, look at the horizon, look at nature. It's an instant, reset, right? When you're in nature and you're broadening your focus, engage your peripheral vision. The other thing you want to do is actually elements of self-care, right? So movement is key. There's some great research to suggest that when you do an exercise session, that you're increasing neuroplasticity and learning. So you don't have to do a whole workout session. Even like 5 minutes of whatever, jumping jacks, a stroll. You could do some push-ups if you're so inclined, self-punishing. So anything like that that just gets your heart rate up is going to be really, really good. You definitely don't want to be looking at a screen at that time. So you want to get away from screens, do active things. One really key and interesting practice that you can do during a break is something we call mental rehearsal. It's sort of used by elite athletes and elite performers in all walks of life. It sounds very simple, but it has profound cognitive effects on the brain. And all that is, it's literally visualizing yourself walking through a successful study day or successful performance on the test. Not just, oh, I'm successful. Not that, but you're actually walking through, you're getting really granular. What does it feel like to look at a question and know the answer? What does it feel like to show up and feel confident and, have a good study session? What does that feel like? So you really spend 10 minutes walking through that. There are apps available for it. I know I said to get away from screens, but if you're just using headphones and just clicking on your little guided practice there, that should be okay. Yeah. But yeah, so you can do these on apps like Insight Timer and other ones that we can link to. The other thing I want to spend a little time talking about, because this is really, really powerful practice called non-sleep deep rest. It's also known as yoga nidra, slight differences there, but it's not a movement-based yoga. You're literally lying down on the ground on your back. You have headphones on. It's a guided practice typically. And it's similar to a rapid body scan, but what's actually happening is very fascinating. Your brain waves are actually becoming closer to delta and theta frequency, which is the same state associated with deep sleep, which is the state of highest neuroplasticity and recovery. So even though you're awake, you're reaping these benefits of sleep. And it's actually been shown to help if you have had a bad night's of sleep. This is something you can do to actually recover some of that. But what's very interesting, it's also been shown to replenish dopamine levels. And you may or may not know that dopamine is associated with motivation. So you're actually increasing your motivation for your next study session. When done regularly, this can prevent that, oh, I just don't want to study feeling that can come up. Some studies have even shown that a 15-minute session can improve neuroplasticity and learning by 50%. So literally all of these benefits by just lying down on the ground with blindfolds on and headphones, kind of doing nothing, right? So why not try it, right? I think there's a lot of great benefits from this. So you could look up yoga nidra or NSDR, non-sleep deep rest, on YouTube, or you could find them in the apps. But they're really, really great practices. The final thing I'll say is build in some strategic rewards in your study session time block. Not every day, because you want these to be like something you look forward to, maybe after a sim exam, something you really enjoy that puts you in touch with things you love. And on that note, something you can do daily as a reward is practice gratitude. We all kind of have a little bit of a negative cognitive bias. It's just how most human beings are. So you really have to work at it to notice your wins. And us sort of overachieving type A people that enter medicine can be extremely hard on ourselves, especially during study period. So it sounds cheesy, but it's another evidence-based tool to lower anxiety and promote productivity, is really finding things you did well in the day. So those are some things you can do during your breaks and just overall to optimize your performance.
Thank you. I love that. I really love non-sleep deep rest. I just discovered that a couple months ago. And now that you've told us all the science behind it, you know, if I'm just laying on the ground by my desk and our managers come by, I'm going to quote it to them, okay?
I gotcha.
No, but seriously, it's really, really helpful for a brain reset throughout the day. I highly recommend that one. And all your other tips, too. I just know that I'm, like, really in love with that one right now. Okay, let's move on to how to stay sane and healthy during dedicated. So for most of us, all of us really, most of us, step one is the dedicated study period is kind of a period of heightened stress. And I think we tend to think, you know, stress is bad, very bad. But really it isn't all bad, right? Can you talk a little bit about how stress can actually be helpful and kind of how to find that balance?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad you mentioned that because like most things in life, it's not inherently bad. Some stress is actually good. Like we talked about, it can promote memory and learning. It can promote motivation. And those are all good things. What matters is it's sort of like a bell curve relationship, right? In terms of your performance. A little bit of stress as you go up, there's a point where too much stress starts to diminish your performance. And the key sort of factor to know if it's too much is when you start to feel like your stress is uncontrollable. So the control issue is key. No matter what the stressor is, you can always control your response to it. But when we perceive that it's uncontrollable, like too many things coming at once, too many thoughts, too many stimuli, that's when it starts to impair performance. So we want to talk about, I think, too, like how do we regain that sense of control over stress so that it can go back to the optimal level for performance.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to hear about that. Do you have any tips that you could share with us? Like when students feel like they have gone over the top of the bell curve and you know, the stress is like getting in the way of their studying or their sleeping or whatever, like how they can regain control?
And it's an excellent question, right? And it's not even just for step studying, but it's for your whole practice in medicine. It's your whole life, right? So, you know, when you're in the middle, so a great example, something that students would often come to me about, is like they're started studying, it's overwhelming, they totally doubt their ability to succeed, they had a bad study day, they tanked a sim exam, and they're just panicking, right? So there's two ways to look at it. One is, what can you do in the moment when you're in this sort of high stress, high alert state? Gonna sound really simple, but there's so much evidence to this that I'm going to sort of spend some time about it, but it's the physiologic sigh. And what tends to happen when we're tense or we're working on something intently is we tend to sort of breath hold a little bit, tend to get tense, we clench our intercostal muscles. The physiologic sigh is a reset button, and what that is it's 2 inhales, increasing basically to your maximal lung capacity, followed by an exhale through your mouth. So it's like, so you can do it once, but really effective method is to do it 15 times in a row. Okay. And you can just hold your breath after that and just resume normal breathing. And in head-to-head comparisons of different types of breathing and meditation, believe it or not, physiological sighing came out ahead as the one tool that not only reduced stress immediately when you were doing the activity of the sighing, it actually lowered the stress response the whole day. So like even when you're not doing it, which is just amazing. Cool. So having a practice like that where things are getting overwhelming, you just let out a sigh and it really just does reset that whole thing. So the other thing you do in the moment as well is come up when you're not stressed with a pocket phrase or an image. These can be incredibly cheesy. Nobody has to know about them. Not that we have cheesy personal phrases or anything, but what you want to do is when you're in the middle of a stress circuit, you want to think about shifting gears, like similar to like, you know, driving stick, which I don't do, so I may be butchering this analogy, but you want to shift gears. You actually want to shift the gears by inserting an image or a phrase into that stress circuit. It sort of short circuits the circuit. So examples are things like, I can handle this, or like an image of yourself like on a mountain, like with your arms outstretched, you know, like you can go super cheesy here, or you can be non-cheesy, whatever your sort of mode is. But you basically want this phrase to have meaning to you. You want this image to have meaning to you, so that even if for a millisecond you can sort of break out of that stress circuit, you're learning a new habit, how to replace that sort of spiral of thoughts that comes with stress, and you're stopping it in its tracks. So those are things you can do in the moment. There's also things you can do daily to prevent that high panic, high alert state from happening. So again, you want to focus on movement, like walking in nature has been really shown to, you know, reduce stress levels, promote that sense of well-being. You also want to practice just in general. There's different types of breath work, like a longer session of something called box breathing, where you inhale, hold, exhale, hold. All of these things are found on the apps that we'll link to. But they're doing regular breath work, doing regular non-sleep deep rest. All of these things are going to help reset your system so that you don't feel that overwhelmed feeling as much, and mental rehearsal. In addition, meditation's a great thing, a great practice to do, if not so much for stress reduction, just to promote focus and attention, which it has been shown in studies to do, so that when you're in a kind of anxious thought loop, you can draw focus back to the task at hand, which is what we want to do. Other less pleasant things like cold shower, cold water immersion, which I've never really been able to wrap my head around, but it does work instantly to sort of reset, you know, your nervous system and you know, kind of relax you in the moment. And then using binaural beats at a low frequency. It's just like there's high frequency binaural beats for attention and focus, using low frequency can calm your brain state down. So there's lots of things you can do, but just know that if this happens to you, you're not alone. I literally had someone coming to my door like multiple times a day with the feeling that they could never succeed, and a lot of them are highly successful individuals now. So this is going to happen, and you just want to know that it doesn't make you any weaker or weirder of a person for feeling this way, because everybody's experienced it. I kid you not, everyone.
Not everybody talks about it, but I think pretty much everybody experiences it, you know?
Right.
And I'm glad that it's talked about a lot more now to normalize it.
Absolutely.
And so some of the things that you were talking about, like, you know, being out in nature, like these are things that people can build into their breaks and maybe even be a little bit preventative, right?
Exactly.
For like going over that peak, just kind of like chip away at it, you know, keep themselves in the right zone of that bell curve.
Absolutely. Prevention's always better than cure.
Yes, right. Okay, well, let's shift to self-care. Now, I know for some people, the word self-care may induce some eye rolling because they may think, oh, bubble baths and, you know, manicures and pedicures and expensive things, you know, massages that are hard to afford as a medical student. But, you know, that's really just like one small part of self-care, right? I think you have a way that you define self-care that's more broad. Can you share that definition with us?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I was one of those eye-rolling people, by the way, because I was like, I'm in school, I don't have time for self-care. It's really not just the manicures and pedicures or whatever's your thing. It is so much more. So self-care can be thought of as the process of constructing a really unshakable foundation of yourself that's not pulled in all these different directions. So it's establishing that strong sense of self. That allows you to take in input in your brain and decide what you're going to pay attention to, which is key, because if you think about people that are burned out or have all the stress or high levels of anxiety, many times it's the inability to control and direct thoughts where we want them to go. So we feel like we're overtaken by something that's out of our control. So self-care is that process of being able to strengthen that muscle to regain that control, if that makes sense. So you really are practicing being able to know who you are, like have a strong foundation. You don't get disturbed from that. So yes, practices like a massage are great, and the bath is wonderful. But in addition to that, there's just so much more. Even like social connection is a form of self-care. And everybody, even Spartan athletes, have to practice self-care. You could be the toughest person in the world, but nobody can function at all cylinders go without that process of being able to recover and recharge. You know, that is needed for you to perform at your optimal level. So again, Self-care does not need to involve a lot of money. It can literally be some of the break techniques that we talked about. It can be having a daily gratitude or daily meditation, daily breathing, breath work practice, having something you enjoy, a hobby. There's so many different things you can do. They can be quick. They don't have to take hours of time. You can insert 5 minutes of self-care, even self-talk. Like modifying your self-talk is a way of self-care. So there's definitely one important foundational thing you can do for overall mental well-being, not just with this exam, but for your life in general.
Yeah, I think that's important. Because there'll be other stressful periods that come up in life.
Oh yes,
after
there
step
will
one
be.
dedicated, step two
This is just the
dedicated,
beginning,
but
guys.
so these techniques we really hope will serve you well throughout your entire life and your clinical career. Trying to cover the basics, things that people can do to take care of their bodies and their minds during dedicated. Let's just start with like eating, drinking, sleeping, things that we kind of all have to do anyway.
Yeah.
You have a background in studying, lifestyle medicine, nutrition, and I go to you with all my nutrition questions, so thank you. So I was wondering if you could just share like kind of a few like higher level and realistic tips for students during dedicated about nutrition, like what foods may be extra helpful for them or foods they should avoid, that kind of stuff.
Definitely. And so, food really is so important, right? So 95% of your serotonin actually comes from your gut, and it affects your everything, like your mental state, even being linked to anxiety and depression. I mean, food is a whole topic of conversation, and it's also like for some reason inspires a lot of passion from people like who think they know the way. And so I'm not here to tell you I know the way for you, but what I can tell you is that there are some universal principles when you're studying and you're having a high cognitive sort of load that you can do to optimize your performance. And they're all very basic. They don't require a lot of money. Remember that even anything you can do to move toward this is better than nothing. So if you're not able to do all of it, you never want food to be stressful. So you don't want your goal of having an optimal diet to get in the way of your overall stress. That would be counterproductive. Number one, just try to eat a rainbow of colors. That's a great rule of thumb because it ensures you get lots of fruits and vegetables. So all the colors, eat fruits and vegetables, nothing's off limits. You can eat as much as you want of fruits and vegetables. I always like to say nobody ever got diabetes by eating fruits. So as long as they're like whole fruits and you're talking about juices and smoothies, which are a little bit different, but just eating whole fruit, whole vegetables, multiple, prepared any type of way that you like. You want to eat foods as close as possible to their natural form. So if you had a choice between something highly processed, like even on the spectrum of if you're taking a grape versus a raisin or orange versus orange juice, pick the food that's closest to its recognizable form. That way you're really limiting a lot of what we don't want you to consume or want to consume for studying, which is highly processed, foods that are like extreme, like refined, have a lot of additives, have a lot of preservatives, have a lot of, unrecognizable ingredients. All your food should be recognizable. It's a general rule of thumb. The other thing you can use for your specific study advantage is glycemic index, right? So you can find this online, like a list of glycemic index for different foods, but a rule of thumb is that the more fiber that's in foods, the lower the glycemic index, which it refers to how quickly is that food metabolized in your body, right? So if you're having like a Coke, that's gonna have a very high glycemic index, huge spike followed by a crash. When you wanna study, you want that sustained slow level release of that complex carbohydrate or fibrous food that's going to help prevent those spikes and crashes and promote attention. So especially beans, chickpeas, legumes, whole grains, oats, so many great foods that with low glycemic index, and highly recommend eating low glycemic index foods, especially before you're starting an intense study session.
Right.
So yeah, and along with all that, really staying hydrated, which is key, like at least half an ounce of liquid per pound of body weight is a good rule of thumb, but you'll notice that when you feel dehydrated, you'll start to lag in your attention. So yeah, food and drink, really key.
Helps maintain a good energy level to focus throughout the day.
Absolutely.
Okay. And then on the drink subject, can we talk about caffeine a little bit?
Yes.
Because I know that like most of us, use caffeine. It's kind of a wonderful substance to help with our concentration and focus. But I think sort of like with stress, there is a bell curve with caffeine. Like if you've ever gone over the other side where you get the jitters and the palpitations, I mean, that's not helpful, right? So
Absolutely.
do you have anything you can tell us about sort of best practices for caffeine as far as like timing or quantity for caffeine consumption?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you can stand it and you're a heavy caffeine user, this may be hard, but do what you can. It's actually useful to do a little reset before you start intense studying, because then that caffeine's actually going to have a great performance effect on you. You said it really well. There is that bell curve again where you do too much and then you're either developing too much of a tolerance where it's not useful anymore, or you get jittery and wired, which we all know is not productive.
Right.
So again, caffeine can be an extremely potent performance tool if you give yourself breaks from it and you don't use too much, right? So what's a great time to have caffeine? Turns out it's not immediately after you wake up. Sorry. You want to wait about 90 minutes to 2 hours after waking for peak performance effects. So why is that? It's because our cortisol levels naturally peak at that time, and morning cortisol levels. If we're consuming caffeine too early, we're not coinciding with that peak, and then we can experience that mid-morning crash. Okay. So when you want and that might lead to that second cup of coffee, and then you're increasing your caffeine intake for no reason. If you can stand it, doing things like a gentle exercise or like cold water or something else to promote alertness, and then waiting 90 minutes after waking to have caffeine, you're going to have better performance effects. Interestingly, there's also different effects depending on whether it's caffeine from coffee versus green tea. Green tea has a substance in it called L-theanine. L-theanine is associated with improved concentration. It's actually got a calming effect. In fact, you could take L-theanine people take it before night to promote a good night's sleep. So green tea is very unique because it has this ability to both stimulate and relax. So you may want to experiment with green tea versus coffee, see what kind of effects they have for you. Tea is really a wonderful thing. We're big tea connoisseurs here.
Yeah. This one's just herbal because we don't want to be up all night, but
which great segue because you don't want to consume caffeine too close to bedtime. Yeah. Typically 8 hours minimum. You may need more time before bed if you're sensitive to caffeine. So experiment with really and if you're like, I can't give up caffeine, maybe switch to half caff, lower your caffeine content, especially before you start studying, because then you can see a visible effect when you actually use it for performance.
Thank you. Going back to then sleep, because we were just talking about not having caffeine where it impairs your sleep. I'd like us just to kind of focus a little bit more on sleep. So I'd like to cover kind of two things, if you don't mind. The first is sort of why sleep is important, because I think when we're under time pressure, sleep is one of the first things to suffer. It seems like easy to give it up, to substitute an extra study session in there, or even maybe at night, you're kind of like, well, I studied all day and this is my time to scroll my feed or to watch this show, and I get that. I've definitely done that at times. But can you talk about why sleep's important, and then also any tips that you have for kind of improving the quality of sleep?
Absolutely. So yes, sleep is really, never sacrifice your sleep for studying. It's not going to be good, because we talked a little bit about delta and theta waves associated with deep sleep are key with neuroplasticity. You secrete brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which literally is like sweeping out the debris in your brain, but also helping neuronal growth. It's actually improving your postsynaptic dendritic growth, creating that branching, that's those new neural connections, which is why something that you couldn't get the next morning after a great night's sleep, suddenly everything's clear. It's like the angels are singing. Yeah. And so that's a great effect of sleep. It's just a recovery tool, and it promotes memory consolidation. So you really want to get good, not only quantity, but quality. Not everybody needs that 8 hours, but you need good quality of sleep. So when we talked about what can you do to improve the quality of the sleep, right? So typical sleep hygiene stuff. Really wind down before bed. Don't do something stimulating before bed. Have a bedtime routine. Follow the babies, right? Parents all know to have a routine. So do the same thing. You want to stop eating about 2 hours before, 2 hours or more before bedtime. And then something calming, that's a great time to do a meditation, a mental rehearsal, non-sleep, or different breathing techniques for relaxation. You want to avoid alcohol, caffeine. We talked about that. Alcohol before bed especially, because it interrupts your sleep quality, lowers your sleep quality. Hot bath, hot shower. This is the time for the bubble baths if you want. You can wear earplugs if you're sensitive to noise. You can wear blindfold, because that is going to be very important, because if you're getting artificial light entering, you're not increasing your melatonin levels the way that you need to. So there is some evidence that actually early morning exposure to light when you want to get up and evening exposure around sunset is also a great way to program that circadian rhythm so you naturally fall asleep well. If you've had a bad night's of sleep, or you wake up in the middle of the night and you're anxious, you can do a non-sleep deep rest too, and that can help you recover the quality of your sleep.
Okay. So like if a person does wake up in the middle of the night, do the non-sleep deep rest, either they'll fall back asleep because it's so relaxing, or they'll get the same benefits as sleep.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, what about naps? Like, let's say a person has a bad night of sleep. Do you think naps are helpful or harmful, or do you have any thoughts about naps and best practices?
Yeah. Naps are great. You want to make the timing appropriate, and that means both the duration of the nap and before bed, right? So if you're a person who has trouble sleeping at night, if you nap, you may want to avoid naps because that night sleep is more important. But if you don't have trouble, typically 20 minutes is a great length of time. You basically want to avoid going into deep sleep, because then you wake up and experience that sleep inertia where it's really hard to get motivated to focus. You don't want that. So that 20-minute time seems to be a great optimal length for napping. There is also some evidence for that caffeine power nap, which is interesting. It's a hack I tried myself with good results, but you essentially drink some caffeine right before you take your nap. So it hasn't had time to have full activation. You sleep, and when you wake up, that's when, it's got its peak effect, and you can actually wake up alert and refreshed. And so that's something you can try if you'd like.
The caffeine power nap.
Yeah.
All right, I love that.
You heard it here. No.
Okay. All right. Well, I think with that, we'd like to go ahead and start shifting over to our questions and answers. I want to say thank you for all of the information you've provided. I think it's been really helpful. And for many of the things that Janani talked about, we'll be putting links, they may already be there, links down in the webinar description. So hopefully, again, you can access those things. And I'm going to open up our Q&A here. Okay, lots of questions.
Oh, okay. That's
all right,
great.
Thank you. Let's see. So many questions. Where to start? Kind of here's like a general one. Like, how long should your dedicated study period be before taking the exam? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. I mean, I know it varies. We'll kind of just conversational like this out, but I know it varies
You're
school
an
to
expert
school.
too, so.
Different schools, I mean, gosh, curriculums are so different now. I don't know if you probably all know this, but like some schools, do all preclinicals and then do dedicated for step 1. Some do preclinicals followed by some core clinical rotations and then step 1 and step 2. So it's going to vary based on your school. I would talk to your upperclassmen and see, for your particular curriculum and how your school has, done as far as administering it, how long people are studying on average. And then generally, there's the dedicated study period, but don't forget that like all of the foundation that you've laid during your first year and second year are also helping you for step 1. So tonight we're basically talking about dedicated, but I've done a previous webinar and we talk about incorporating UWorld even into your preclinical curriculum, because if you can be practicing these test questions throughout, then you'll be getting a head start on your dedicated. But I would think that at a minimum, probably somewhere in like the 4 to 6 week range.
I was going to say 6 weeks. Yeah, I think
because people probably want a number.
There's so much information, right? And you want to have enough time to go over that.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. What's the holy grail approach to UWorld? Studying one chapter and then solving questions and making flashcards? I'll answer this one. So the holy grail approach actually starts before dedicated. So I'm going to kind of answer that part first, and then we'll see if we can kind of adapt it to dedicated. But the Holy Grail approach is really, if you have, like, let's say a systems-based curriculum and you're going through, then you kind of take the number of questions that are in a particular system, say the cardiovascular system, and as you do the cardiovascular section in your school, you're going to divide that number of questions by the number of weeks and do them alongside. You can even use the categories to kind of look through the subsections of the cardiovascular system and walk alongside your curriculum, right? That's like the Holy Grail, because you'll get a whole first pass done by the time you get to dedicated, and then you can do like a second pass during dedicated. And kind of focus more on exam simulation and your weak areas and all of that stuff. And so then I guess how that would apply to dedicated, like if a student's opening up the QBank for the first time during dedicated, based on what we talked about, I guess a Holy Grail approach would be doing a balance between that comprehensive review and the subject-based review, spending a little bit more time on the subjects that they're weak in, right? Like
I
the
would
nephrology
say, yeah.
for me back in the day, among other subjects. I mean, it wasn't my only weak subject, but like renal tubular acidosis had me pulling my hair out. So,
gosh.
But do you have any other thoughts about that?
I agree with you.
Yeah.
I just think when you are, if you haven't had the pre-dedicated study approach, really using that the known evidence for test-enhanced learning to maximize your learning for your weak areas.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like really like honing in on those subject-specific questions for those weak areas, and then making sure you still do the comprehensive, like the randomized question blocks, because you don't want to miss that opportunity to replicate the exam.
Right. And I would also say, like, if the Holy Grail approach was a first pass during curriculum and a second pass through the QBank during dedicated, a modified version of that, if you're just getting to the QBank during dedicated, like realizing there's lots of questions, would be if you can try to get through a first pass. If you have a little extra time, maybe go back and look at the ones that you did incorrect or, answered incorrectly or that you marked as difficult, and kind of do like a mini second pass of those things. That could be kind of a way to adapt the Holy Grail approach to like a dedicated only approach. Okay, how do I get through the reviews of questions that I've already taken a bit quicker? I currently spend hours on it because even the wrong answers have so much information that feels important. I think that's a great question. And I appreciate that point because both of us help write explanations, and we work really hard on those wrong answer explanations to make them high yield for you. So we didn't mention that earlier, but it is really helpful to read over those because there's a lot of pearls in there. But taking the reviews a little bit quicker. I don't know, did you ever have students ask you that question back in the day?
I would say that's actually it's unusual because most people are not actually spending that much time. So it's good that you're doing that. If you're spending hours, chances are you're not using enough active approaches as you're reviewing those explanations. So you're just kind of reading it and maybe getting a little overwhelmed because there's so much new information. And so one method that has been useful for students is to really have like a separate document or file or paper where they're literally jotting down points that are like sticky areas or unclear areas. They don't have to go and actually look up all that stuff, right? Like let's say you're reading, like, because sometimes those questions are testing multiple different organ systems and you haven't gotten to that. Rather than going and reading all about that organ system, you just jot it down and be like, make sure to review this. Or, as you get closer to exam day, if there's that like renal tubular acidosis, you're like, darn it, I missed it again. So you just like literally keep writing it down, using flashcards too. Like it is going to take a little longer in the beginning, right? But the idea is as you get better and better with the active approaches, it should start taking less time. If it is taking too much time, I would explore whether you're really being active in your review of the explanations.
Okay, I think we covered this one briefly. How long should breaks be between the 60 to 90 minutes focused study time? You had mentioned that at least 10 minutes is helpful. I think I just read about, like, there was a study, now this wasn't done with medical students, but it was like companies who used like keystroke software, and they looked at their top 10% of performers, and it was like on average, I think the focus segments were 52 minutes. correct me if I'm
Yeah,
wrong, and the
52
breaks were
minutes.
like 17 minutes,
Yes,
right?
right.
So, I mean, that's like very specific, and it
Yeah.
was, you know, like
Yeah.
kind of a different area. But I mean, I think these are like legit companies and
Yeah.
high-performing people,
Yeah.
and so that might be kind of a place to start, and people can experiment and see what works for them. I don't know what you think about that, or if you have any other numbers that you want to throw out
Yeah, it's
there.
interesting because the studies were looking at those like kind of very like tedious tasks. So from that standpoint, it can be effective. I would say, again, this goes back to knowing yourself. You want to come back to that. You want to come back to your next study session feeling somewhat recovered. You're not going to feel like totally like, I don't know. I feel like these analogies are all similar to like the gym, right? You're not going to recover to the point where you feel like it's a brand new day, but you don't want to come back like feeling depleted. You want to come back feeling at least a little recharged. Typically, I would say, 15, 17 minutes.
Okay.
You want to maybe do a longer break in the middle of the day. You kind of have to play around with it, make sure you're getting all of your content areas and the concepts that you want to cover. You want to make sure you have time for that without feeling overwhelmed at the end of the day. You know what I mean? But you want to have enough time that you're feeling recharged when you come back.
Yeah. There's a question here that says, I find that it's easy while studying to find myself in a mind state where I am lacking confidence in my abilities and feel like a failure. What can I do to boost my confidence?
Yeah, you are definitely not alone. I think we've all experienced that.
Yeah.
And I've had so many students come to me with the exact same question. It kind of goes back, right, to the things we were talking about. So this is just a form of you not being able to direct your attention to the thoughts you want to direct your attention to. You're letting those thoughts and you're not letting them, but basically due to the lack of mental muscle, which we can build, these thoughts of like, I'm a failure, I'm not gonna be able to do this, are coming to the forefront. So all you have to do is learn to pay attention to the thoughts that serve you better. And the ways to do that, number one, mental rehearsal. It's kind of like fake it till you make it, but this is actually like evidence-based, right? You want to spend that time really imagining yourself being successful. What does that look like? And it's got to be very specific. Just sitting there being like, I am successful is not going to do anything. You have to walk through that. You have to like imagine your body moving through those movements and like literally what does it feel like to look at that question and know the answer, right? So practicing mental rehearsal is going to be key. And at first it may feel artificial, but that's the thing. You're just creating new neural circuits. As you do it again and again, that's going to start to become like kind of your new normal. It's really a key thing. If you look at successful performers, they didn't all start out knowing they were going to be successful. They really had to practice believing it. So again, know that people are going to have down days. Nobody feels 100% successful all the time. But the key is how quickly can you rebound from those feelings of feeling like a failure? How quickly can you recalibrate? So never look at your feeling of being a failure as a failure. You want to be able to recalibrate from that. Like it is serving, maybe it's teaching you that maybe there is something that you need to put your attention on. That's fine. But there's actually research to show that it's not productive to dwell on a quote negative emotion for any longer than 90 seconds. In fact, that's the full amount of time it takes for your body to feel an emotion. Past that, you're just replaying a mental loop over and over again. So literally break out of that by going to your positive phrase, the positive image. These things sound really simple and so maybe are a little underrated, but I have seen not only in students but in patients immense success just from using these techniques. So very common.
Yeah.
You are speaking probably to many, many people who have the exact same question. Just keep at it, do mental rehearsal, do your work, and get those images and phrases down.
I feel like that kind of reminds me a little bit too of, when you get like a song stuck in your head, the way to get it out of your head is not to be like, oh, don't think about that song, don't think about that song. You know what I mean? And you have to replace it with something to like drive it out of your head. I know it's slightly different, but like, when you're having those feelings, thinking like, oh, don't feel that way doesn't help you not feel that way, right? So having the positive phrases or images that you can go to instead and practice them, fake it till you make it, kind of rewire your brain progressively over time.
Totally.
I think is a really good advice.
It is.
Let's see. There's so many questions. Thank you for all your questions. Let's see. is it useful to map out exactly which subjects you should be reviewing to make sure they are all covered during the 6 or 7 weeks of dedicated? I think that that's a pretty good approach. I know a lot of people will use like UWorld with like first aid or something like that kind of has some structure. But as you mentioned earlier, knowing yourself and focusing on areas that are your weak areas, like a little bit more time on those areas, I think is helpful. I think a lot of students have a feeling for what that is as they're coming out of their preclinical curriculum. I mean, I know for me, like it was never a question that renal was like we keep coming back to that. It was like by far the area I struggled with the most. And I already knew that. But let's say you want to, maybe you think you're strong in everything, or maybe you just want extra data. I think taking a sim exam early on, so there's 2 sim exams that come with our product in the I think 180 plus day subscriptions. Taking a sim exam kind of right at the start of dedicated can help you identify some of those other weak areas, and then as you create this structure of all of the things that you want to cover during your 6 to 7 weeks of dedicated, tailoring that to you. So I imagine it's probably the same nowadays, but back in the day, like upperclassmen would kind of pass on what their like study schedule was in some sort of like, spreadsheet format, and you'd see exactly how many days. Like you don't have to do that exact same number of days, right? You shouldn't. You probably should be tailoring it to yourself.
I agree.
Would you agree with that, or do you have anything to add to that?
I agree with that, yeah. I think you should map things out as much as possible, but be flexible in case things need to change, but not too flexible because you don't want to start going, all over the place. You want to have some systematic approach to what you're doing. So mapping it out in advance can be very helpful.
And mapping it out with some buffer time in there, and self-care time and breaks and things like that. Yeah, definitely do that. There was a question here, I'm not sure if I'm going to find it, but about what to do like the day before the exam. Because, don't map out studying hardcore the day before the exam. I think you need to take care of yourself and kind of get your brain ready. Do you have any thoughts about what to do, the day before the exam, or share what you did? Or
Oh, yeah. Well, I wouldn't do what I did, right? I don't think I did any of the right things. I made it a lot harder on myself than I needed to. But yeah, no. So day before the exam is a great time I recommend, so you can do mental rehearsal as long as you don't get too anxious, because sometimes it's like right there and you can't be in the mental rehearsal, you're just in anxiety, not helpful. But if you can imagine walking through that day and it going really well for you, that's a great thing to do. Like it's almost like you're calibrating your brain to notice the positive on test day. I recommend doing something really fun and just relaxing. I wouldn't do something too social with a lot of people unless you have a good group of friends who aren't going to talk about the exam.
Right.
But just something relaxing. The whole day before the exam, in my view, should be a recovery day. Like just think of it again, like before a marathon, you're not training that day. You're usually resting, eating pasta, kind of something similar.
Taking a bath.
Taking a bath. Just go full on self-care that day is what I would do. Like I would recommend that. Definitely don't. Some people, I'm not going to say don't study at all. Some people actually do find good benefit from just reviewing a one-pager, or they're like bullet point,
their
like
most
high yield.
Yeah.
You can do that. I just wouldn't spend a long time doing it. I might just refer to it, and then you got to give it time to recover. The brain has to recover. So non-sleep deep rest you could do, so many good relaxation activities.
Yeah. I totally agree with that. And I don't know that we talked about this during the webinar, but in previous conversations, when we were kind of brainstorming this, you had mentioned that, it's not uncommon to get a bad night of sleep before the performance day. And I just thought that we could bring that up, because if it happens to you, don't panic. Do you want to talk about that just for a minute?
Yeah. You can actually, if you do regular non-sleep deep rest, you're actually building up a buffer zone too, because you're actually getting the deep sleep benefits, right? So if you've been doing it regularly and you have one bad night of sleep, it's really not going to be detrimental. When we talk about lack of sleep, we're talking about chronic sleep debt, right? Not one bad night. It's very normal for that, test anxiety to hit full swing on that night. And so if you wake up, you just relax, know that you're in good company. Probably all your classmates are experiencing similar things. So no worries, you're still gonna be fine. That one night of affected sleep is not going to be the end of the world.
Because you said previously that it's like common among like high performance athletes and everything too, right?
Oh,
and
yeah.
Then they go and run their like Olympic sprint or whatever, so it's that like sleep foundation. Mm-hmm. So yes, do what you can to, relax and refresh yourself the day before your exam. But just know you do the best you can if you don't sleep as well. And do all the sleep hygiene, do all of the things. But should you run into a less than optimal night's sleep, it can still be okay. I just want to kind of put that out there because I think that's pretty common.
Very.
So,
and you really want to think about yourself as being a resilient person. As human beings, we're resilient, right? So you're not going to get affected by little variations here and there, and that resilience is key to, having that confidence to know that when things are out of plan, you're going to be okay. That might happen on test day too. So.
Right. Okay. I think we're getting kind of close to the end of our Q&A session. So. Here's a question that we should probably answer. Can we pass step 1 by solely doing UWorld? And are you able to get all the concepts you need? Well, that's kind of a loaded question, but an important one, I think. So I'll try to answer that one. So UWorld, when we create our step 1 bank, we think we're about as comprehensive as it gets. When you say, do you only need to do UWorld, I mean, I wouldn't skip your preclinical classes or anything like that. And I imagine that you'll have a few supplemental resources. Like a lot of people use first aid, right? Or they use a pathology supplement, that kind of thing. But the UWorld question bank for step 1, if students get through the entirety of the questions, and there's quite a few questions, you are getting the breadth of what you need as well as the depth of what you need to succeed on step 1. So I would say it's not the type of thing where I would say only do UWorld, don't go to class, don't do first aid, don't do a pathology supplement, but I would say definitely do UWorld. I think it's probably a number 1 thing that you can do to succeed on step 1. Are you able to get all the concepts you need? I would say yes to that. And
yes.
And I think it's using it in a smart way. So the ways that you talked about it, because it's active learning. I mean, it's really helping you get those concepts. We've talked about, just trying to remember the points that we've talked about here about why the question bank is so successful. It's not just the passive reading like you were talking about.
It's you're making that information your own. You're really integrating it into your neural circuits. Memories are stored in different parts of the brain. They're not just in one place. So when you're activating multiple units, you're really synthesizing that memory deeper. And I would say UWorld is very comprehensive, so it's going to be incredibly helpful as a major primary tool in your learning. The one thing is that passive material can help you contextualize that. So if you're doing nephrology, you read that information, then you have something to draw upon when you're doing your UWorld questions.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Right.
You could think of it, UWorld's where you're really honing in that learning. And then that passive material is just refreshing, giving you facts to remember, but then it's really, you're doing the work when you're actually doing the UWorld questions. It's you're learning to swim. You're not just reading about swimming, you're actually swimming in the process of doing the questions.
Right, I agree with that. And I feel when you mentioned earlier too about going deep into, a few resources being better than spreading yourself out thin, I feel UWorld's a place where people can really go deep. They can take any of the tables or pictures that we have and make flashcards, use those to review, your sticky points. They can use my notebook and create an electronic notebook of things that you're going through. So when you were mentioning jotting down things, that you want to come back to, you can do it that way. Or just key points.
So the tables and the images are great things that could be anchors for your learning. So that's a great point.
So I would say that I would really prioritize your use of UWorld and just know that it is really providing that comprehensive coverage that you're going to need. So thank you for that question. All right, I think we are pretty much out of time. We really appreciate all of your questions. We appreciate you joining us today. I really appreciate you joining us today, Jenny, and thank you so much for all your advice.
Could talk about wellness for hours.
Yeah,
so, you know.
And so maybe we'll have another webinar on that. We'll see what y'all put in there in the chat section about what you'd like to hear about. So we're going to be signing off, and we just want to wish you the best of luck as you study from all of us here at UWorld, and a good night. Thank you.
Good luck.